In his path-breaking article on the nature of the firm, Ronald notes that the neoclassical model of a competitive economic system fails to explain the existence and the organization of firms. He also complains that this model relies on prices to guide resource allocation, but treats these prices as if they're free for everybody to use at no cost. And this concern is stressed in his most famous article, The Problem of Social Cost. The article on the nature of the firm presented an innovative explanation of the internal structure and managerial methods of the firm, but did so in tandem with this criticism. Oh, the heck with this. Did so in tandem with this criticism. Now, I think the problem here is one of methodology. That Ronald's interest is on the inner workings of the firm, and he made a major contribution to that in the nature of the firm paper. But that wasn't the objective of neoclassical economics. Neoclassical economics wanted to study the effect of, in a decentralized economy, on resource allocation, of getting all your information only from the price system, and just the price system. It wasn't really very interested in the inner workings of the firm, and Ronald was right. It didn't say much about the inner workings of the firm. You know, we got marginal cost, marginal revenue, magically they get solved in the theory of the firm. But Ronald is incorrect in saying that neoclassical theory has no theory of the firm and no theory of why firms should exist in an economic system that is guided by prices. And I think that's incorrect. It's incorrect because it does have a theory of the firm, but its theory is different from Ronald's. In the old days, when I was a young man studying economics, we used to have a circular flow diagram. On one part of that circular flow diagram were firms, and the other part of that circular flow diagram were households. And goods circulated to households, resources circulated to firms, and payments for these went in the reverse direction. And it became clear in that diagram that there was a terrific, difficult coordination problem of getting all these entities to do the things that end up being efficient to do. And that was the objective of constructing the neoclassical theory, was to explain how this happened. So there are firms there in that model, and the reason firms exist in that model is that specialization is productive. The rationale for firms in the neoclassical model, the rationale for the existence of firms, is that specialization is productive. And so it does have a theory of the firm there, and its theory is based on the function of the firm. The function of the firm is to produce goods for sale to others. That's its function. So its theory of the firm is a functional theory of the firm. It's not a structural theory of the firm, as Ronald's is. And it does have a rationale for its existence. So I think Ronald is following a different goal when he constructs his theory of the firm than neoclassical theory did. The neoclassical theory's firm serves its purpose well, which was to understand the allocation process of a price system. Ronald's firm has very little to say about the allocation process of the price system. On the other hand, the neoclassical theory has very little to say, nothing to say about the internal structure of the firm and its organization, its administration. So there are two different goals here, and two different models are useful in approaching these goals. But it is incorrect for Ronald to say that there is no theory of the firm in neoclassical theory. And it would be incorrect for neoclassical theorists, if they were still with us, maybe I am, to say Ronald's dealing with structure ought to use neoclassical theory's firm. So they're just different objectives, and different firms serve those objectives. So that's on point one. That I think Ronald does not do justice to neoclassical theory there. This doesn't at all take away from the impact of Ronald's work on the institution of the firm and the structure of the firm. The second thing is that Ronald complains about the fact that prices are treated as if they're free in the neoclassical model. And that's a legitimate observation. They are treated as if they're free in the neoclassical model. But I don't see how the neoclassical model could have ever accomplished this task without assuming that they're free, because its task was to see how resource allocation would be affected by prices. If you deny people knowledge of prices, it could never answer that question. And when you introduce the cost of transacting, what you do is deny people complete knowledge of those prices. Okay. So if you think of transaction costs as being infinitely great, people have no price information. The neoclassical model could not at all deduce its notions of how prices affect the allocation of resources in that case. Same thing is true as long as transaction cost is positive. To some degree, it derives positive transaction cost deprives people of knowledge of gained by way of prices. So in order to accomplish its goal, which was to understand the allocation of resources by way of prices, it necessarily must assume that prices are free. So again, I think that Ronald is too harsh in his treatment of the neoclassical economists. Now, for Ronald's purpose of understanding the vertical structure of the firm, it's very useful to understand that prices are not free. Okay. On the other hand, I think Ronald draws some incorrect conclusions from that. Because with the neoclassical theory of the firm, if transaction cost is zero, firms can reach out farther to serve households than if transactions costs were positive. Okay? So the importance of the firm in the economy becomes larger. Less production takes place in the household, which would be self-sufficient production, and more takes place in the firm, the lower is the cost of transacting. But if you look at Ronald's structural argument on the firm, he interprets an increase, a reduction in transaction costs as a reduction in the importance of the firms and an increase in the importance of markets. Okay? And so it's a fundamentally different implication that you draw from these two theories. Okay? I think the neoclassical theory is correct about the importance of firms in the economy. The lower is transaction cost, the more important firms are in the economy, not the less important. So there is some conflict between these two theories. Now, Ronald is correct. The lower is transaction cost, the less vertical integration there will be in a firm. Okay? But that's not necessarily an index of the importance of firms. Transaction cost goes down, firms become more specialized, less vertically integrated. That's true, but their reach is much farther into the economy, and much less self-sufficient production takes place in the household. The proper contrast for neoclassical theory is not between the firm and the market, it's between specialized production in the firm versus self-sufficient production in the household. And that's the substitution that takes place, and the degree of substitution responds to the cost of transactions. For Ronald, the substitution is between the market and the firm. But there is no such substitution as that in neoclassical theory. In neoclassical theory, prices don't produce anything. They can't be a substitute for firms. All they do is convey information. So on this score also, I think Ronald is too hard on a neoclassical economist. Once you understand what the neoclassical economists were trying to do, and indeed succeeded in doing, you understand why the difference in the approach between them and between Ronald in studying the institution that we call the firm. Now, these are methodological issues. They have to do with what is the objective of the theory. And once you recognize what the target of the theory is, you can begin to unravel these theories and give a more sensible comparison of them. And that's what I did very briefly here for you. The next issue is a different issue. It's not a question of unraveling the theory, but I'm sorry to say it's a question of logical error. And this is the problem of externalities, or more correctly called the problem of social cost. As you all know, or should know now, Ronald made a terrific contribution there because he stopped the runaway belief that Pigou was right in the profession. And nobody could deny him that contribution. But he did it in two steps. One, he says, well, suppose the transaction cost is zero. If transaction cost is zero, then you get the negotiations between the interacting parties. It all gets resolved in an efficient way, just as it would in neoclassical theory. Okay? But Ronald recognized that nobody else, and no one else did, that Pigou never expressed the logic by which an externality could exist in a context in which the assumptions of the perfect competition model hold. And the zero transaction cost case is exactly one of those assumptions, okay? If you have zero transaction cost case, then there is no such thing as an externality in there. Ronald says, but we live in a world in which transaction cost is positive. And then he starts to deal with the positive transaction cost case. And in it, he supplies a rationale that connects the existence of an externality to the assumptions of the perfect competition model. He supplies Pigou with the ammunition that Pigou didn't supply himself. And he says that in the case, and I don't want to quote him here, I do have a quote here, but I won't read it to you. He says, in this case, the market may be inefficient. May be inefficient, not necessarily. Okay. And why does he say this? And it's very interesting, and partly reflects Ronald's background. Ronald, are you here today? Okay. He says, well, suppose these two people want to use the same scarce resource, and the title to that resource, the ownership title, has not been well defined yet. So they go to court, and the court pronounces one person an owner and the other person not an owner of the scarce resource, common law court. And after the court's decision is over, they go outside the court, and if the transaction cost is zero, they negotiate with each other, and whichever person could put the resource to the highest value use will acquire the title, even if the court didn't award it to him, by virtue of these negotiations. Okay. But if transaction cost is positive, they walk out of the court, they can't negotiate with each other. Now, transactions costs are too costly. So if the court had given ownership of the resource to the person less able to put it to high value use, it would end up being underutilized in the economy. Okay? And that Ronald misidentifies as an inefficiency of the economic system. It's not an inefficiency of the economic system. It's a mistake of the court if the court wanted to produce an efficient solution. Now, the court does not appear in neoclassical theory. Neoclassical theory begins by assuming all resources are privately owned. There is no ambiguity as to who owns resources. There is no court there. The court is a non-market institution. If you don't believe it, ask Richard Posner is here how difficult it is for him to collect a payment for a correct decision. Okay? the court is purposely designed to be excluded from market purchases. Okay? We can't call that an economic institution. If you made it an economic institution, the court never would have given the ownership to the person who used the resources less well than the other person, because the other person would have been able to pay more money to the court to get the correct decision out of it. So this is an error, not of the legal system. You may not want to call it an error because the court may have a different set of objectives than efficient resource allocation. But this is a result of a decision of the court. Not the best thing. An efficient economic system takes the court's decision, just like it takes a governmental decision on the distribution of wealth, as a given, and it minimizes the losses or maximizes the gain given that decision. And that's true in this case. If it's too expensive for these guys to exchange the ownership title after they walk out of the court because transaction cost is positive, it's efficient not to have the transaction. It's not an inefficient economic system. If somehow the economic system tolerated the transaction, despite the fact that the transaction cost exceeds the gain in the value of realigning the ownership, that would have been an inefficiency. So the economic system is not inefficient in that. And what this means is that the appeal to transaction costs by Ronald Coase has not produced the rationale that's needed to substantiate the compatibility of an externality problem with a perfectly competitive economy. Okay? I don't.
3 more minutes.
Okay, that's good. I don't deny the possibility of an existence of an externality, but the appeal has to be to something else. Okay? And I thought about this a lot, and I keep coming back to the old appeal of the communists and the socialists, that the government can do something cheaper than the market can. Okay? You could fail to have a transaction between a laundry owner and a steel mill, with the soot descending on the laundry from the production of steel with soft coal, either because the cost of transactions is too high, or because they both realize that the cost of hard coal is too high to make a transaction worth undertaking. In both cases, the transaction doesn't occur. In the second case, we don't call it an inefficiency. Why do we call it an inefficiency in the first case? It's the same damn thing. Okay? That means you need an excuse for the government to be able to handle some kind of allocation problem at less cost than the market can. Because what can the government do that the market can't do? Coerce. Okay? Now, some problems, like taking care of global climate, whether you believe in the global climate problem or not, if you believe it, require a coercion that the market cannot exercise. And it's that kind of situation which gives rise to a meaningful externality. Thank you very much. But if you want to know an answer to a simple question, but in a complex context, if you want to know how a price system, if you have the price system being the only influence on people's allocation decisions, aside from their personal preferences, you have to assume they get the price information.
Mark Schauss. My favorite Coase article is his article
On the lighthouse.
And
That's wrong, actually.
Yes.
The article's wrong.
Yes, it is wrong.
It's wrong. It's brilliant, but it's wrong.
Well, let him ask his question.
in that respect, I'm interested in the response of each of you on that evolution of that article. And I wonder if any of you have seen the article by Walter Block, which disputes this whole argument that lighthouses were privately funded originally. And apparently they've always been publicly funded. So could any of you comment on that I'm really taken with it. I noticed that Samuelson has commented on it in his textbook. Nordhaus argues that every case he's looked at, the lighthouse is a public good. So I'd like to get the response of the four of you, if you would. Is the lighthouse a public good? Is it a private good? How do you see Coase's article on the lighthouse?
Well, what the lighthouse is or isn't is partly an empirical question, and there's obviously debate about that I'm not going to shed any light on. But the article itself does have a defect in it, I believe. And, I don't know if it's the same thing that you're going to point to, but it was an attempt to show that the free rider problem could be dealt with privately. But it isn't dealt with privately there. There's a government that controls the port and collects the payments.
Yeah.
And I think that is a defect of it. Now the answer to that, which is not an answer I like, and I don't know whether Ronald made it or somebody else made it, is yes, but it shows how private parties could get together to get the government to do something. So, but I think that's a defect in the
Let me tell you what, Harold's right about this. What happened is there were two ways you could fund lighthouses. One of them is for the lighthouses which were not designed to deal with the coastal traffic, but were designed to deal with entrance into port. What happened was the way they paid for the lighthouses, when you paid your customs duty, some fraction of that fee collected by government was used to maintain the lighthouse. And the objection that was made in the 1830s to that particular configuration was they priced it at monopoly levels, and so that you were paying too much for the kind of service in question. And they thought that if you switched to direct public funding, you would be able to eliminate the monopoly problem, and then of course what you do is you create all sorts of other problems. How many lighthouses do you build, and so forth. So in the end, it's this exact kind of trade-offs that he had in the marginal cost controversy. You could pick any ways of financing these things, and every one of them is going to have some kind of a defect. But if you think of the time when the switch took place, 1830s, this is not 1906. This is not the Trade Disputes Act. This was a perfectly classic question of, if you've got multiple ways to fund public goods, which do you choose and why?